Lusitania. Mediterranean though it can feel, Portugal is the only European country that has the Atlantic Ocean lapping around the inner harbor of its capital city. Its amazing mariners took its oddly inflected language as far away as East Timor and Macau, though King Henry, the navigator, probably never actually boarded a ship. As soon as I could manage it after the revolution of April 1974, I arrived ordinarily enough by air, and was then told to wait in the customs area. Was I perhaps on some list of undesirables, as I had found myself to be at other airports? A lanky, white-haired official, proffering a card that proclaimed his name to be Vieira de Francesca, just like the delicious port wine, extended a hand. He was to escort me to a hotel. It appeared that I was an honored guest. For the first time in my life, I was on a list of desirables. When the files of the former secret police of the Salazar Catiano dictatorship had been broken open, it was found that I listed as a particular foe of the Ancien regime. Having imagined myself dossing down happily with my comrades on the floor of some left-wing slum apartment, I was promoted to a fairly elevated floor of the Tivoli Hotel on the Avenida Libertad, with a view of the city's captivating harbor. It all seemed too much, as if one had suddenly received the profits and dividends of an investment that had barely been made. I formed a private resolution not to become too used to it. But the fall of fascism in Lisbon in April 1974 was the occasion for an almost perfect storm of radical desires. The overthrow of the Cateno dictatorship was not only part of the long postponed business of cleansing Europe of pre-1939 fascism, it was also a sort of revenge for the destruction of the preceding autumn, on 11th September to be precise, of the Allende government in Chile. There were other happy convergences at work also. With the old gang removed, the grip of Portugal on its African colonies was broken. And this meant not only the emancipation of Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, but also an acceleration of the process that would eventually terminate racist rule in Rhodesia and South Africa. Other revolutionary ripple effects might be expected in Portuguese-speaking Brazil, the largest and in some ways the most vicious of the authoritarian military regimes of the southern cone of the Americas, while the effect on neighboring Spain surely had to be a demoralizing one from the viewpoint of Franco's military and religious allies. A whole series of fault lines radiated away from the Lisbon earthquake, all of them shivering the structures of traditional order. And this was simply to speak politically. The cultural element made it seem as if the best of 1968 was still relevant. One of the precipitating pre-revolutionary moments had been the publication of a feminist manifesto by 3 women, all of whom were named Maria. The 3 Marias became an exciting example of what womanhood could do when faced with the rhetoric of oligarchy that had treated them as breeding machines, not far advanced above the level of chattel. Sex, long repressed, was to be scented very strongly on the wind. I remember in particular the only partly satirical Movimento de Esquerda Libidinosa, or Movement of the Libidinous Left, with its slogan, Somos un partido sexocratizo, whose evident objective was the frantic making up of lost time. The best revolutionary power I saw, perhaps the best I have ever seen, expressed this same thought in a rather less erotic way. It showed a modest Portuguese family in traditional dress being introduced to a receiving line of new friends who included Socrates, Einstein, Beethoven, Spinoza, Shakespeare, Charlie Chaplin, Louis Armstrong, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. There are many people in much richer countries who are still putting off this rendezvous. As well as being a colonial power, Portugal under fascism had managed also to let itself become a semi-colony, whose main export was cheap labor to the rest of Europe and whose illiteracy rate was about 30%. The resulting division of the country between the boss class and the officer class and the rank and file was very striking. The astounding thing in the mass demonstrations that thronged the Avenida Libertad and Rocio Square was to see the squads of uninformed young sailors and soldiers joining in with the workers and the students. To my eyes, an almost literal replay of the scenes from Battleship Potemkin or the storming of the Winter Palace. And, once I had cleared my eyes by drying them, I noticed that the parallel with St. Petersburg could be drawn in other ways too. In 1968, the ferment of revolution had taken the ossified French Communist Party completely back, forcing it in effect to line up with de Gaulle. This it had done, partly to protect its position as the party of order, and partly to obey Soviet instructions, and the anti-NATO and anti-American regime of the Gaullists be left as far as possible unmolested. In Portugal, no such inhibitions were in play. Because the old order had irretrievably vanished like breath off of a razor blade, and there was a good old-fashioned power vacuum, or, as we used to say in factional meetings, a situation of dual power. Workers' committees were forming embryo Soviets, soldiers, and sailors' collectives had whole ships and regiments under their temporary command. Landless workers on the countryside were taking over abandoned farms and properties. There were two things to notice about this. One was that hardly a shot was fired. The Portuguese may have exported a good deal of their violence overseas to Africa, but in the country itself the rhythms were, when compared to neighboring Spain, say, remarkably gentle. As a possible metaphor, in Portuguese bullfights, the bull is not tortured or killed. The matador tests only his own agility and bravery against the noble beast. The second thing to absorb was that behind all the spontaneity and eroticism and generalized festival of the oppressed, merrymaking, a grim-faced communist apparat was making preparations for an end to the revels and a serious seizure of the state. The USSR is the sun in our universe, proclaimed Alvaro Cunhol, leader of the Portuguese Stalinists, who had returned from exile in Moscow to direct operations. The tactics were more those of 1948 in Prague than St. Petersburg in 1917, consisting of the slow acquisition of positions in the army and the police, and the application of what used to be called salami tactics against other parties. The Portuguese Socialist Party enjoyed the support of a majority of the people, so it was not only by coincidence that one of its main newspapers, La Repubblica, became the target of a spontaneous takeover by the print workers, which their communist union bosses endorsed as if butter would not melt in their mouths. Nor was it by coincidence that the Chemical Workers Union, which had a latent socialist majority among its membership, found some of its communist officials oddly reluctant to hold a ballot. The emergency nationalization of the banks meant opportunities in a state that had formerly been corporatist and monopolistic, and for the bureaucratic new class to become the owners of the large tracts of Africa, and the proprietors of seats on the boards of newspapers and television stations. The leader of the Socialist Party, Mario Soares, a man whom I would normally have regarded as a pulpit and compromising social democrat, summarized the situation with some pith. I still have the question he put to me, double underlined in my notebook from Lisbon. If the army officers are so much on the side of the people, Why do they not put on civilian clothes? It was a question, not just for the moment. I began to be extremely downcast by the failure, or was it refusal, of my international socialist comrades to see what was staring them right in the face. Intoxicated by the admittedly very moving attempts at personal liberation and social self-management, they could not or would not appreciate how much of this was being manipulated by a dreary, conformist sect with an ultimate loyalty to Russia. Thus I found myself one evening in late March 1975 at a huge rally at the Campo Pequeno bullring in Lisbon, organized by the distinctly cautious Socialist Party, but with the invigorating slogan, Socialismo si, Dictatura no. The whole arena was a mass of red flags. Another chant echoed the original one. There were calls for the right of the chemical workers to vote, a banner that read "Down with Social Fascism," and another that expressed my own views almost perfectly in respect of foreign intervention in Portugal. Nem Kissinger, nem Brezhnev. I took my old friend Colin McCabe along to this event. For his numberless sins, he was at the time a member of the Communist Party, and at first employed an old Maoist catchphrase, waving the red flag to oppose the red flag, to dismiss what he was seeing, but gradually he became more impressed, and as the evening began to crystallize, he unbent so far as to say, "Sometimes the wrong people can have the right line." I thought then that he had said more than he had intended, and myself experienced the remark as a sort of emancipation from the worry, which did still occasionally nag at me, that by taking up some out-of-line position I would find myself in bed with, as the saying went, unsavory elements. It's good to throw off this sort of moral blackmail and mind-forged manacle as early in life as one can. The sequel takes very little time to tell. The communists and their ultra-left allies hopelessly overplayed their hand by trying for a barracks-based coup. The more traditional and rural and religious elements of Portuguese society rose in an indignant counter-revolution. A sort of equilibrium was restored, and, a finita la commedia, the young radicals who had come from all over Europe to a feast of sex and sunshine and anti-politics folded their tents and doffed their motley and went home. It was the last fall of the curtain on the last act of the 1968 style, with its "Take Your Desires for Reality" wall posters and its concept of work as play. For me, it was also the end of the line with my old groupuscule. I had developed other disagreements too. As the old and open-minded international socialists began to murate into a more party-line sect, but Portugal had broken the mainspring for me, because it had caused me to understand that I thought democracy and pluralism were good things in themselves, and ends in themselves to that, rather than means to another end. In his superb collection of essays, Writers and Politics, which influenced me enormously when I first found it in a public library in Devonshire in 1967, Connor Cruise O'Brien had phrased it better than I could have hoped to do. "Are you a socialist?" asked the African leader. I said yes. He looked me in the eye. "People have been telling me," he said lightly, "that you were a liberal." The statement in its context invited a denial. I said nothing. And yet, as I drove home from my interview with the leader, I had to realize that a liberal incurably was what I was. Whatever I might argue, I was more profoundly attached to liberal concepts of freedom of speech and of the press, academic freedom, independent judgment and independent judges, than I was to the idea of a disciplined party mobilizing all the forces of society and the creation of a social order guaranteeing more real freedom for all instead of just for a few. The revolutionary idea struck me as more immediately relevant for most of humanity than were the liberal concepts. But it was the liberal concepts and their long-term importance, though not the name of liberal, that held my allegiance. One can read such things and understand and even appreciate them, and one can undergo experiences that call one to the original text as if in confirmation. I cite O'Brien not as an argument from authority, for I was to have many disputes with him down by the years, but as a man of considerable mind who brilliantly summarized the contradictions with which I had been living, and with which, in many ways, I was condemned to go on coexisting for some time to come.